Welcome to episode 2 of the Catching Made Simple podcast. If you don't know who I am, I'm Anj Bourgeois, and I transferred from a middle infielder to a catcher my junior year of college. So if you're young, you are not late. Don't you worry. When I transferred, I learned a ton of stuff about catching. I had some big wins, I had some big failures, and I am here to share all of those lessons with you. So, episode 2 today, we're talking about the catching crisis. Okay, what is the catching crisis? The catching crisis is that catchers play the most important position on the field. Without a doubt, you talk to anyone who understands baseball, catching is the most important position in the field. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But the problem is no one knows how to teach catching. Catchers don't get attention at practice, and they're kind of neglected. So let's jump in. I created a little visual for us. Catchers play the most important position on the field, okay? And maybe I'll zoom in here so that you can see back behind me. But one of the biggest reasons why they play the most important position on the field is because pitchers actually play the most important position on the field because they initiate every play. A play doesn't start in baseball until the pitcher throws the ball. But here's the thing. Pitchers get taken out. They only throw so often. So while the position of pitcher is truly the most important position on the field, they rotate. Well, guess who doesn't? The catcher. Not only does the catcher touch the ball more than anyone else on the field besides the pitcher, not only are they involved in calling pitches and really running the strategy of the game, they're also in charge of managing the staff of pitchers. And so you'll get certain pitchers who say, I won't even pitch unless I pitch to that catcher, right? That's how powerful the catcher is. That's how much influence the catcher has over the game, over the season, over the pitching staff. As we think about how do we really utilize that position of catcher for the influence that it has? A big part is understanding the different components that go into it. Okay, so that's a big one, that the catcher has a huge influence on the pitching staff, managing the pitchers, and making sure that they are taken care of. Okay, now one common reason why people say that catchers play the most important position on the field is because they're the only ones to see the whole field. Now, I actually think this is a pretty big misconception of what makes something important. I think importance is truly defined by impact. What's funny is just because someone can see the field when other people can't, that doesn't mean that you play a more important position. Now, perhaps if seeing the field is super, super important, and it is, but that doesn't mean that you play the most important position just because you can see the rest of the field. So yes, that is a factor, but it is not one of the major factors of truly why catchers play the most important position. The main reason is because they have more influence over the game and they have a ton of influence over the pitchers, and they touch the ball more often than other people. So that leads us to one of the next reasons, is they're in every pitch, right? And we'll talk about this, but if you just take the law of numbers, the people who touch the ball more are going to be more important. That's why positions up the middle, like pitchers, catchers, shortstops, center field, that's why those positions are so important, is because they touch the ball more than the people on the corners, right? That's why the shortstop is typically a little bit more important than the second baseman, is because there's more right-handed hitters, there's more balls hit to the shortstop, so they touch the ball more, right? And then, in addition, they have a longer throw, right? But they're in every pitch. And because they're in every pitch, because they're calling the pitches for the pitchers, because they're in charge of the strategy, they have the most opportunities to influence the game. And the more opportunities you have to influence the game, the more important your position is, right? That's why a manager is also a very, very important position, even though they're not necessarily playing, because they have a ton of opportunities to influence the game. And if you make the wrong choices, then you're going to get the wrong outcomes, right? So catchers have a ton of opportunities every single pitch, calling pitches, working with the pitchers, adjusting the field, all that stuff. Okay, so those are 4 strong reasons why catchers play the most important position. Now, here's the crisis. Catching as a whole is misunderstood, and one of the goals of this podcast is to help you understand catching and baseball more in depth, and specifically what are the common misconceptions about catching and how can we best prepare our catchers to be successful, and how do we need to think about catching in order to have the greatest impact on the game, right? If it is the most important position, let's understand why, okay? The reason that a lot of people don't understand it is just because they misunderstand it. And no fault of their own, they're never taught, okay? That's a big part of why I'm making this podcast, okay? Overlooked is the next one. Again, because people don't recognize how important the catcher is, they just overlook it. They don't pay the attention to it that it deserves. You know, another example of this, I didn't say this earlier, but you know, the catcher has such a huge responsibility, especially if there's runners on base, to not give up extra bases, because the more extra bases we give up, the higher likelihood it is that someone's going to score, right? You tally up all of those opportunities through dirt balls, through throwing runners out, through making sure that we receive every pitch well. If we lose those opportunities, there's going to be a massive impact on the game and on the amount of double plays that we can turn, because we're giving up the double play because we had a pass ball when there's a runner on first, or you know, we get a runner goes from second to third with one out because of a pass ball or a dropped ball, and now a sac fly scores him rather than him staying at second base, right? So all these little things, since we don't understand how important catching is, we overlook it, okay? That's the second one. Undercoached, all right? This is another one, and this is really interesting. I was talking with one of my catchers, and he said, we did a 4-week training program called the 4-Week Catching Fundamental Challenge, and I was talking to him after, and he was like, man, I did this 3-month thing with this place that was actually specifically for catchers, and I actually didn't get that much better. But here in the 4 weeks that I worked with you doing things virtually, I got so much better than I got there in 3 months. And we were talking more, and one of the things that he said was, you know, my coach, he doesn't understand catching. Like, he doesn't know how to teach it. And we were talking about it, and he said the reason why is because he never caught. He was a shortstop his whole life. Doesn't make sense that he would know how to teach catching. Before I learned how to catch, I had no idea. I knew what looked good and what looked bad, but I didn't really know. A big reason that catching is undercoached, especially at younger ages, is because they don't know how to coach it. All right, if you're a coach and you're watching this, you're gonna learn, okay? So I'm really excited to spend time with you. And then finally, mismeasured. This is one of the most interesting things for me because I'm also in the sales and marketing world, and one of the big things that they talk about in the sales and marketing world is that marketing is mismeasured. They measure the wrong things, and so they get the wrong outcomes. And that's totally how it is in catching as well. Really what the problem is catching is really hard to measure. It's hard to measure how well someone receives. It's hard to measure how well someone blocks. What's easy to measure is a stopwatch on a pop time. Because the pop time is so easy to measure, and we'll talk about this in future episodes more in depth, but because the pop time is so easy to measure, we have skewed towards measuring the wrong thing because it's easier to measure that thing. And so because what we measure matters to us, when we spend more time measuring a pop time, then what happens is we end up placing more importance on the pop time than it deserves. And so the pop time throwing is really the least important skill because it happens the least amount of times in the game. What's really most important is receiving and then blocking and then throwing. And again, we'll talk about this in another episode here coming up. The mismeasurement also applies to why there's a catching crisis, because we're measuring the wrong things, we're trying to optimize for the wrong things, and therefore we don't actually help catchers develop skill sets in the things that they need to develop in order to get better. So that's what we got, the catching crisis. Thank you for tuning in to the Catching Made Simple podcast. And if you haven't already, make sure to take the 7-day stance challenge. It'll make sure to teach you in 5 minutes a day how to have a stance like the pros, the main problem with the stance, and the 5 most common stances that you need to master if you want to catch. So you can get that at catchingmadesimple.com/stance. And again, thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. If you have any other questions you want me to cover, drop them in the comments below this or send me a DM on Instagram. I'm looking forward to diving in deeply to all things catching and being the most trusted resource on catching for you. All right, I'll see you soon.